Alrighty, whenever we're ready.
Here's the first question. Hi, Ben. Nice speech. I'm Peter.
Nice to meet you.
So I go to high school right over at E.O. Smith, and a lot of my friends, liberal. It's a pretty liberal atmosphere. They're kind of talking about like Germany being better in economic growth, being better with controlling inflation, things like that, and how we should emulate them, do something like the EU. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
I mean, the EU is failing, so that's economically illiterate. The fact is, the United States is by far the world's powerhouse economy. It will continue for the foreseeable future to be the world's powerhouse economy. It drives the entire economy of Europe, too. We paid their defense bills for something like 50 years, so that helps as well. Germany had to, I mean, they took austerity measures like 4 years ago. They had to cut back on their social programs. Angela Merkel got in hot water with her own party and with a lot of the voters specifically because of this. So the idea that Germany has a stronger economy than the United States, there's always somebody who's saying somebody else has a stronger economy than the United States. Like 5 years ago, people were saying China has a stronger economy. 20 years ago, people were saying Japan has a stronger economy. The answer is no, no, and no. The United States has far and away the strongest economy in the history of the world.
Hello, Ben. My name is Martin.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm not really a fan, but I like hearing you talk.
Thank you for showing up specifically because you're not a fan.
Right. I like hearing you talk. So one of my questions is, you talk about this culture between black and black violence. What is your solution then to that?
Don't commit crimes. I mean,
I feel like there's a bigger issue.
I mean, my broader solution really is that these communities require more police, not less. There's a woman named Jane Levy who writes for the LA Times. She's actually on the left, and she wrote an entire book about how a lot of the disparities in crime, particularly in black communities, were due to racism, but not in the way that we think of racism, like white cops going in and beating people up in black neighborhoods, but because white people basically said to black neighborhoods, take care of yourself. Right? And if there's high violence in your areas, then you take care of it yourself. Well, that leads to higher tribal levels of violence in any society, right? Whenever there's not an enforcement mechanism in place to actually stop crime, then the crime rates go up. And in fact, you know, the broken windows theory in New York City has saved an enormous number of black lives because the police were actually present and active. You need more active, present police hunting down people who kill other people. That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that you actually need fathers who stick around. This is true in white communities and black communities. One of the great tragedies of the last 4 decades in the United States is that the single motherhood rate has risen not just in the black community from 20% in 1960 to over 70% now, but in 5% in the white community to over 40% now. That's a huge jump in both communities. Young men particularly do need a male influence there to curb them. As a man who was once young, I can attest to this. So I think that that's another aspect. And obviously, once you actually lower the crime rate, then you're going to get more economic growth. This is what's happened in particular areas of New York, where once the police were actually able to go in and shut down crime in particular areas, then suddenly businesses could come back in. They weren't afraid of being robbed. And suddenly people were willing to live in those areas who weren't willing to live before. This is gentrification, and gentrification is a good thing. Right? The left has opposed gentrification by suggesting that, oh, it's people throwing people out of their historic homes and all this nonsense. The fact is that if the quality of life in an area gets better, not worse, that seems to me an undeniable good. Right? So if the area gets better, that's gentrification. If the area stays crappy, it's ghettoization. I mean, there has to be some solution. You can't just claim that when things get better, that's racism, and when things get worse, that's racism also. Right, so the reason that New York City has gotten better is because of increased policing. So increased policing, a cultural focus on fathers staying in the home and mothers not bearing children out of wedlock, and an individual commitment not to commit crimes.
So just following up real quick after that, so would you say the solution then is to improve education in that sense, teaching these people early on to stop doing these things?
I mean, I honestly don't think that the quality of the educational system is heavily connected to crime. Just because I don't think that schools are the folks who teach people not to kill each other. I think that's usually your parents. So I think that the quality of schools is more a reflection of the poverty of neighborhoods than it is the cause of crime rates in neighborhoods. I think it's more of an effect than a cause, in other words. Okay, thanks so much.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
My name's Jaron. Just had 2 quick questions for you. One, how do you think it will play out if Oprah actually runs for president? And 2, can I grab a selfie with you?
So I'll have to ask security about the selfie since I'm not in control of my own fate anymore, unfortunately. But as far as the Oprah running for president question, I don't think it's going to work out the way she wants it to. So there's a poll yesterday that came out, Trump versus various Democrats. Against Joe Biden, I think it was 57-40. Against Bernie Sanders, it was like 55-40 in favor of the Democrats. And then against Oprah, it was 51-42. So she was polling worse than Biden and Sanders. The reason that I think that she'd be in trouble is because, number one, I do think she'd win the primaries, because I think it'd be very hard to defeat her in a primary. But I think that in a general election, here's the thing about Trump. Trump is basically made of mud. What I mean by this is that if you're a politician, the worst thing that can happen to you is someone throws mud on your skirt, right? Suddenly you were pristine, and then someone throws mud at you, and you're dirty. Trump is a mud monster. You cannot hit him with anything. Right? I mean, literally nothing. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, we found out that he probably paid a porn star $130,000 not to talk about an affair that he had with her when he was married to Melania and his son had been born 4 months ago, and no one cared. Okay, that right there is the sign of a candidate who you can do nothing about, right? What that means is that Trump is never going to be a 60% guy, but he can be a 45% guy because he's already gotten 45, 46%, and that means that he can duplicate his performance of last time, and nothing you say about him can drag him down. Oprah is almost the opposite. So Oprah starts off at 51%, but that's because everybody thinks of Oprah as kind and wonderful, and everybody loves Oprah, yeah. And then it'll turn out that people will start digging into the school that she ran in South Africa for years, and that had 2 separate pretty brutal sex scandals against children. Or they'll start digging into all of the weird health conspiracy nuttiness that she's done on her show. And the minute that people start actually tossing mud at her, because she's considered angelic, that mud shows up on the white skirt a lot better than it would show up on Trump. So I think that she would be a lot weaker, a stronger candidate in the primaries than people think, a weaker candidate in the general than people think.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. It's a pleasure. Big fan. My question has to do a little bit with Jordan Peterson and the recent hysteria with, Canada's Bill C-16.
Yes.
With the compelled speech law, right? I just want to know, do you think that there's anything to worry about in America as far as compelled speech goes, government overreach?
Yes. And so I think that anti-discrimination laws are going to be used as an excuse to crack down on religious institutions and people who disagree. So the way this will happen, because that's what Bill C-16 is. It's an anti-discrimination law. The idea is that you are discriminating against people if you do not use their proper pronoun. Right? This already exists, by the way, I believe, in New York City. The New York City Human Rights Commission passed an ordinance that will fine restaurants like $250,000 if they do not address a patron by the pronoun that person wishes to be addressed by. I don't know how that stands up to the First Amendment. I really don't. But that also requires a Supreme Court that's willing to implement the First Amendment. And so that depends a lot on whether Justice Kennedy has had his bowel movement that day. It's impossible to predict whether Justice Kennedy is going to go one way or another on any particular issue. I do see this happening in California. There was already an attempt to strip the Boy Scouts of their 501c3 status in the state of California because the Boy Scouts weren't allowing gay scoutmasters. You could certainly see something very similar happening if they refuse to address people by particular pronouns, or if a church or synagogue refuses to perform a same-sex wedding. They can say, okay, well, you have a nonprofit status, but you're violating our view of what should happen with regard to marriage. The state now recognizes marriages between men and women and women, so we're going to remove that status from you. I think that we're moving pretty quickly in that direction. That's where the left clearly wants to go. The only question is whether the constitutional barriers will be strong enough to prevent it.
Do you think they are?
Again, I think that it depends. I think it's up to us. I don't rely on the Supreme Court to protect the Constitution because it historically has done a pretty poor job of it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shapiro, for being here. It's truly amazing that you were able to come. My name is Justin, and I have one question for myself and one for my brother, who unfortunately couldn't be here. He asks, what actual actions that Trump has taken do you like and think are beneficial?
So there are a bunch of them. So I've actually been asked to grade Trump on policy before, and I say is that on executive policy, I give him an A-. On legislative policy, I give him a C. It would have been a D except for the tax bill. And on rhetoric, I give him an F. Because, I mean, I like complete sentences. But when it comes to his policy, I mean, Justice Gorsuch is great. The cuts in regulation are great. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem is great. The tax bill is really good. The attempts to take land out of the hands of the federal government and open it up to development is a very good thing. Half of the land in the West is owned by the federal government and run by the federal government. The new religious freedom regulations that he's promulgating in HHS, all of these things are very good things. So I think that on policy, he has been quite good, at least as far as he can do it with a Congress that's so fractious. again, on rhetoric is I think where he's done the most damage. And I will say this, in evaluating Trump, I don't just evaluate him on policy. So I think a lot of conservatives want to say, his policy is good, so why aren't you happy? And the answer is, I'm happy with his policy. Right? But being the president is about more than policy. It's also about, can you help build the social fabric? Can you make America a place that is more unified, not less unified? Can you make the country a better place to live because people don't hate their neighbors? And on that score, I don't think that the president's done a very good job at all. I think on the score of the policies that I like, he's done great.
And my question is, I don't want to say you're wrong in doing this, but why do you feel it's necessary to react so sharply to leftists and the views that they hold, and react so sharply to the views, to beliefs that they hold about opinions that are?
Well, I mean, I think that it depends on the context. So when it comes to speaking with forceful language about the policies of the left in broad strokes, I think it's important to point out where I think not only they're wrong, but they're misguided. And in some cases, the views of the left I think are patently morally evil. Actually, when it comes to the idea that, for example, you have a right to my labor, I think that's an evil statement. So I feel very strongly about that. You can disagree with the feeling, you can disagree with my opinion, that's fine. When it comes to dealing with people who disagree with me, I'm actually, I think, pretty cordial, as you saw from the first question. So it depends on how people address me. If I'm addressed with and people want to have a nice discussion, I've done this all my life. I love doing that. I prefer it. But if somebody is going to throw brickbats, then I'm going to respond in kind. So you get to choose you get to choose the weapon for the actual face-off.
First, I'd like to say thank you for coming, especially after the reputation we developed last year. So my name's Ian. I don't necessarily agree with you and everything, but that's where I came here. I'd rather be here than my own echo chamber.
Well, thank you. I mean,
so you said that you consider transgenderism a mental disorder, which is something that I don't know enough about to properly debate you on and criticize. So more broadly, that then brings me to ask, do you think that the United States should do more to develop proper infrastructure to take care of people generally who suffer from various mental illnesses, or are we doing a fine job at
No, so the
this?
answer is yes. I think that the typical route of taking care of people who can't take care of themselves more broadly, and I don't believe, by the way, that every form of mental illness requires an entire system of infrastructure, right? I don't think that a transgender person is suffering the same type of mental disorder as somebody who has severe bipolar disorder, for example. And my grandfather, on my father's side, my dad's dad, suffered from either manic depression or actual schizophrenia and had to be institutionalized for a while. That's a different thing than transgenderism, for example. So the treatments are not the same for every mental disorder, of course. But the idea that people who can't take care of themselves need some sort of net is well established in sort of American public life. But I would suggest that the place that you start is the place that everyone starts when they need help. You start with the family. If the family can't help, then you go to the community. And I mean generally the religious and social community. If that can't help, you go to local government. If that can't help, state government. If that can't help, federal government. One of the great tragedies of our mental illness system is that it's been federalized. So it used to be that local and state communities were largely responsible for funding mental health facilities. In the 1960s, JFK, because he had a sister who was mentally ill, thought that the federal government could do a better job, and he actually imposed from above a federal system in terms of mental illness and how to take care of people who are mentally ill. That actually removed responsibility from states. States just threw the burden onto the federal government. It's made facilities worse. In the 1970s, there was a vast release of people who were mentally ill and probably shouldn't be on the streets onto the streets. That led to a significant uptick, for example, in homelessness. A huge percentage of people who are homeless across the nation are people with severe mental illness who need to be on drugs. And are not being given their drugs and are being told that it's an aspect of freedom to live on the streets and live in misery. I don't think that that's right at all. So that's my short answer as to what we need to do with people who can't take care of themselves.
Hey Ben, my name is Carmi, huge fan. I'm originally from LA too, moved in 2012.
Why would you move to this weather, dude?
Well, my dad's a rabbi, so he moved.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
So do you think the GOP rigs election with gerrymandering and voter ID laws? And specifically with Roy Moore, the Roy Moore election, 97% of black people voted for Doug Jones. People say that they saved the election.
Well, I mean, so as far as voter ID, I do not think that voter ID is discriminatory. If I have to show an ID to buy an alcohol, it seems to me that I should have to show ID in order to vote. This does not seem like a huge burden on me. I mean, voting seems to me a significantly more important decision than what type of beer I get or whether I have to buy a crappy Zima. As far as gerrymandering, the truth is that gerrymandering, there are only two ways to do districting, right? Way one is that you have some sort of quasi-impartial board that actually draws the districts. The problem is these boards are rarely impartial, and historically those boards have been biased to one side or another, and so gerrymandering has been the way that we've done politics in the United States for 300 years at this point, or at least 250 years. So the idea that that is something out of bounds or crazy is sort of ridiculous, especially because the argument seems to be that once Republicans enter power, then they can gerrymander the districts so Democrats never get elected again. Okay, literally 2 years ago, the Democrats had the presidency, and in 2009, right, I'm old enough to remember this, in 2009 the Democrats ran everything, and Republicans were never going to win again. And then Republicans won the House and they won the Senate. Now it probably looks like Republicans may lose the House, despite the gerrymandering. And then, you know what'll happen? The Democrats will gerrymander it right back, right? This is what happens in state legislatures all around the country. So the idea that it's some sort of grave thing that we have to be deeply concerned about, I don't see the evidence that it's super grave. I'm open to the idea there's a better solution than gerrymandering. I'm just not sure that the solutions that have been proposed, these sort of bipartisan boards, that those are necessarily the proper solutions.
Thank you very much. And may I also take a selfie with you, possibly?
Oh, well, I don't think the other guy got to, so that's kind of unfair. But we'll see if afterward we can do some selfies.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for coming. A common criticism liberals, or particularly progressives, often levy at conservatives is the absence of compassion, so to speak, in the formation of our policies. Especially under Trump. So what is your position on if compassion over logic, perhaps, or
empathy
whatever
is stupid.
balance?
So, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, empathy is dumb. The reason I say this is not because I don't have empathy for people. It's because you should not make policy based on who you care most about. If I did, I would take all of your money and give it to my kids. I like them better than I like you. Right? The fact is that, I mean, there's an entire book on empathy that's specifically about why empathy in policy is a problem. Sympathy is fine. Right? Having sympathy for people is good. Having empathy for people is not great. The distinction being, if you have sympathy, you feel bad for someone. If you have empathy, you put yourself in the shoes of that person. But by doing so, you are now not in the shoes of everybody else. The best policy that can be made is the policy that is about the data and the number of people who are affected, because you can always find the person who's the most victimized and then make policy around that person, as opposed to trying to create policy that affects the most people in the most beneficial ways. So, I mean, it's great to be empathetic. I don't see empathy as much of a moral value as some other people do. I don't think feelings are in and of themselves moral values. I think behavior is moral much more than feelings. Maybe this is my Judaic background, but Judaism is much more an acts-based religion than a grace-based religion, meaning that in my religious viewpoint, I think that God cares much more about what you do than how you feel about it. I think politically speaking, some of the worst things that have ever happened were based on good intentions. And so, trying to formulate policy that is the best without violating people's rights is a better way of doing policy than saying, I empathize with this group of people or this particular person, and therefore I'm going to shift policy to meet them there.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. My name is Josh. It's a pleasure to meet you. So political polarization in America is an increasing problem as the years go by. My questions kind of tie into each other. The first one is, what do you believe is the root cause of this problem? And the second is, how would you go about fixing that?
Great question. So I'm excited about this because I'm writing an entire book on it right now. So, I think that the root cause of the political divisions in American society and Western civilization more broadly is that there is a telos-shaped hole in our heart that is now being filled with tribalism. So that's a very complicated way of saying that. Telos means purpose for those who are not philosophy students. In the Aristotelian and Platonic view, the way that you derive your value as a human being is by acting in accordance with nature's law, essentially. That if you look at the universe, what you see is that man is a creature of reason. If you act in accordance with that reason, then you are acting in accordance with your purpose. And there's a whole set of virtues that you have to cultivate in order to act best in accordance with your identity as a reasoned person. And Aristotle recommends these. Judeo-Christian values seem to mirror these pretty strongly, which is why for basically the entire medieval scholastic period, there was a great identity between Aristotelian thought and Judeo-Christian values. And that carried forward all the way through most of the Enlightenment, actually, despite some pushback to the contrary. The American founding was based on this essential idea that every right has a corresponding duty, that you have a purpose in the universe that is laid forth on a religious level by your religious community, by the Bible, and on a reasonable unanswerable level by a universe that requires certain things of you under natural law, right? This is what the founders talked about when they talked about natural law. I think all of that's been lost. I think it's been systematically undermined by 200 years of philosophy that says that God does not exist, the Bible is a fraud, that you cannot get to ought from is, right? The David Hume distinction that just because the universe is a certain way doesn't mean that's how you ought to be. And once you do that, and you say to everybody, make your own purpose, it turns out people are not good at making their own purpose. When people try to make their own purpose, they end up usually at hedonism or at self-interest or at the triumph of the will, or at the idea that if we shape together as a community, then we can create utopia together. And you've seen all of those things happen in the 20th century. I think now the most common area in which people are finding fulfillment is tribalism. Because our sense of community has broken down so much, because religious communities have declined, people don't see each other as neighbors or friends anymore. We look at the United States and we don't see a set of common principles that we all hold to. I mean, this is a perfect example tonight. We need probably dozens of security members just for me to talk. We don't have the same set of values anymore. Because of that, people are filling that hole with tribalism. They're filling that hole with, okay, there's a bunch of people who look like me, and therefore those are my people, and I'll stand up for their interests. And you see this, I think, to a certain extent in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think you certainly see it in the alt-right movement. And all of these tribal movements are deeply disturbing and cut against the grain of Western thought, which has been moving toward individuality and universalism simultaneously for the past several thousand years, and is now moving, I think, in a completely sideways direction, thanks to the undermining of these key concepts. Purpose, individual purpose, the capacity of individuals to take control of their lives, communal purpose, and the capacity of a community to set boundaries around individual behavior so far it doesn't hurt other people, and also to ensure people's freedom.
Now, just as a reminder, we want to have people who disagree with Ben. You guys can come skip the line.
Yeah, just raise your hand.
Hi.
No cheating.
Yeah, I disagree with you.
Perfect.
And I was wondering, I personally, I'm a progressive, and you know, I was just wondering, with our current political atmosphere right now, why is it that we have strayed away from not just right or left or just general people in politics stray away from facts and try to twist around the truth? For example, like with Fox, MSNBC, all these big corporate news programs, they tend to have an agenda. Why is it that it's so hard to get facts out to people?
I mean, I think it's always been hard to get facts out to people is the truth. I think that narrative has always been more prominent in our mind. What we want to believe, I mean, confirmation bias is obviously a very prevalent thing. What you want to believe, you tend to believe, and you tend to look for excuses to believe it. I think that in the era of mass media, where every taste can be catered to, you see that a lot more often, obviously. And so if you think like Rachel Maddow, you're likely to watch Rachel Maddow. If you think like Sean Hannity, you're likely to watch Sean Hannity and have all your biases confirmed. That's one of the reasons why I hope that I'm at least attempting to present facts, even some facts that disagree with my position, and then explain why, you know, those are wrong. And if you present a fact to me that disagrees with my position, I'll acknowledge the fact. I'll either say that it strays from my framework or not. I mean, it's something that I strive to do. Maybe I fail, but it's something I'm trying to do. I think that the reason that people have strayed away from fact and moved into subjectivity is because there's something comforting about subjectivity. You can never be wrong. The thing about facts is that somebody can prove you wrong. It's uncomfortable to be out there on the limb all the time waiting for somebody to saw it off behind you. Right? Doing what I do, it's a lot of fun. I mean, I love what I do for a living. But I will also say that there is a constant feeling of, am I right? And when somebody says you're wrong, if you're a good person, you think, well, maybe I am wrong. Let me examine that more. And it's uncomfortable to feel like you're wrong. Every time you feel like you're wrong, it means that you have to examine your presuppositions and think about whether you're saying the right things. And so I take criticism seriously, or at least I try to. And I think that's a hard thing to do, and especially in an era where we have been told that there's a virtue to being offended, that you being offended is a substitute for you learning something, that if you don't like what I'm saying, then you being offended is enough for you to just dismiss it out of hand. You don't have to go home and do any research. That's made things very convenient for people, particularly everybody's into virtue signaling now. It's very easy. This is why you see these kind of tsunamis that start where people will call Steven Pinker a racist. Right? I mean, Steven Pinker is a lefty. Steven Pinker only says that there are differences in biology between men and women, for example. Or he'll say things like I've said, that there are different crime rates in particular communities. And then he'll get blasted for this as supposedly upholding alt-right views. That's because people want to believe that those facts are not right, and so they will blame his motivation and then attribute to him a motivation that he doesn't like. So if we can refrain from questioning each other's motivation and go to maybe where we go wrong in logic, then maybe we can have a conversation. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why, even though I'm an Orthodox Jew, I never cite the Bible in defense of my positions, because I know that a lot of people don't believe in the Bible, so we can't have a conversation on common ground here.
Good evening, Ben. My name is Quinn. My question stems from attending Turning Point USA's Student Action Summit in West Palm Beach just a few weeks ago. Seeing you speak and seeing how attendees were excited about the United States moving the embassy to Jerusalem. While I do believe that the land rightfully belongs to the Jews, I do not think the moral obligation is sufficient reasoning to intervene in this conflict. As libertarians, non-interventionism is a key tenet of the philosophy. Why should we continue funding anything in the Middle East, even Israel, given our track record? And why is intervention on Judeo-Christian moral grounds permissible, although we have a separation of church and state?
Okay, so it's not intervention on the basis of Judeo-Christian morality per se, meaning if it were just on the basis of Judeo-Christian morality, then we would not be giving aid to any of the other countries in the Middle East, for example. We give aid to Saudi Arabia, we give aid to Egypt, we give aid to Jordan, we give aid to the Palestinians, some $300 to $400 million a year. By the way, I'd be much happier if we just cut off all aid. I mean, I think there's a strong case to be made, the Rand Paul case, that you just don't give foreign aid, period. But if you do give foreign aid, then the idea is that it's supposed to be in our national interest. So then the question becomes, is it in our national interest to be involved in the Middle East? And this is a question, I think, that was decided relatively conclusively on September 11th. Right? I mean, the idea that we can sort of retreat from the world and that we can just intervene in sort of policing actions, as the Clinton administration did, came home on 9/11, and 3,000 Americans died because of that. So the idea that a powerful America in the world is unnecessary, that we can retract within our own borders and that there won't be some enemy that comes and fills the space. By the way, that does have impact on commerce. That does have impact on our economics. It does have impact on how people live. Now, my view is sort of the view of the Founding Fathers, which is that we ought not be entangled in permanent alliances. We should always be looking to what is in our interest. But one of the things that defines our interest is the fact that we are a good country, right? We are great because we are good is the idea that if we were to be a completely amoral country, then we would not be worth standing for. Right? We should be, to the best of our ability, balancing moral obligations that we have as the leader of the world, in which capacity we've liberated Europe twice, and in which capacity we've liberated the people of the Soviet Union, and in which capacity we have liberated the people of South Korea. You know, all of those things are great goods. I think it's one of the reasons why the United States is the beacon of the world and why it's something worth defending, not just on power grounds. So, but on a realism level, if we don't make more allies, then we have more enemies. If we don't back our allies, then those allies are likely to suffer catastrophic defeat. If we don't side with the countries that side with us, then we are likely to see those countries side with somebody else, and that puts us in a negative international position with regard to issues that a lot of libertarians do care more about than defense, things like trade, economics, and even culture.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Connor. I was just wondering, I agree with you that like biologically a man is a man and a woman is a woman. I was just wondering what you see the detriment of society, like why we can't like let a transgender like woman be called she or something.
Because it is a lie.
I
lies are
agree.
Detrimental to society. So I think there are a couple of reasons. So yeah, sorry, you let him finish the question. That's fine.
No, I'm just wondering, what do you see? I understand it's lying. Like I was taught not to lie. I just don't understand what is so wrong about that specific lie.
Well, I mean, as opposed to other lies, I'm not sure there is anything wrong. I mean, I don't like all of them. But as far as that specific lie, I think that one of the problems that we have is this determination that men can become women and women can become men undermines some barriers between men and women that I think are useful and good, particularly in children. So if I have to teach my 3.5-year-old, right, she's almost 4, if I teach my almost 4-year-old girl that she can become a boy, then I think that is not only lying to her, I think it's confusing her, and I think it's damaging to her psyche. One of the premises of the transgender movement is that human minds are completely non-malleable. That oddly enough, men are not men and women are not women, but if you are transgender, that is unchangeable, and that especially among children, if a 3 or 4-year-old has certain feelings, those feelings have to be taken completely seriously. We can't fight against them. We can't suggest that the kid will grow out of it. Instead, we have to say that this kid is inherently transgender. I can tell you, having kids are incredibly malleable. Kids are easily confused. And saying to a child, which is what the transgender movement would like to do, I mean, they're having drag shows in kindergarten now in some areas. You know, when you do that, when you confuse kids about gender, you're doing the kids no favors. You're doing them or you could be doing significant damage to kids. Kids should not be confused about their biology. Kids should not be confused about their gender. And let's put it this way, just from a certain statistical standpoint, if it is true that the transgender suicide attempt rate is 40% over the lifetime. And if I am right, then more kids will be confused about gender, which, by the way, you do see. You've seen an uptick in transgender surgery in Europe. You've seen a greater identification as transgender overall in places like Europe, malleable rates of transgenderism in Europe. If that's the case, then you're raising the suicide rates, presumably, if there's an association, between for young people who are now confused about gender. So I'm not in the mood for countenancing lies about what men and women are, specifically when I think that there is a goal of redefining a key term for the entire society.
That's fair. I was just wondering.
Yeah.
I just disagree there. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, so my question is actually about your opinion on healthcare, because I know that you believe that privatization of healthcare is the most effective means to solve the problems that we have. Yet besides thought experiments, I really haven't seen any evidence for that. For me, when you look at the facts, you look at more socialized programs such as Canada, they spend 10% of their GDP on healthcare, and yet their life expectancy is in the low to mid-80s. You look at the UK, and they spend 8.8% of their GDP on it, and the life expectancy is also in the 80s. But then you look at the United States, we have a more privatized system. We spend 15.4% of our GDP on it, and yet our life expectancy is lower. So my question is, why do you, my question is basically, if you look at all that, what it tells me is socialization of healthcare covers more people, makes life expectancy longer, and it's just more effective all around. So do you have any evidence or examples where privatization has actually increased healthcare?
Okay, so the truth is that we haven't actually seen a move from a socialized medicine system to a privatized system. So it would be hard to find an example where moving from one of those examples to a privatized system works. And we haven't really seen even a system where we move from privatization to universal health care in the sense that the system has never been deregulated. I mean, my basic premise is that what we have now is almost the worst system. We have a mixed system which has driven up costs because of subsidizations from Medicare and Medicaid, and has also driven up costs because of regulation, and then it's still privatized, so doctors are still charging a lot of money. The best example that I can use is a small-scale example because it doesn't exist in large scale. By the way, we can talk about problems in socialized medicine systems. We can talk about the fact that there is rationing of healthcare that does occur in places like Canada and Britain in a way it doesn't with regard to surgery, particularly in the United States. We can talk about cancer survival rates in the United States, which are better than cancer survival rates in socialized medicine countries. We can talk about the fact that it's not you really shouldn't statistically compare life expectancy between Canada and Britain and the United States because the populations are incredibly different. Just in terms of ethnic diversity, the ethnic diversity in the United States is very different from the ethnic diversity of Canada. Right? Canada is nearly homogenous. The ethnic diversity in the United States is very different, and different ethnic groups do have different health problems. For example, heart disease is more prevalent in black men than it is in white men. That's just a fact. That has nothing to do with moral culpability or anything. That's a reality that is taught in medical school. It's the way they profile patients. So you'd have to find a comparable population to start. Then you'd have to actually model it out. But the best example that I can think of is, well, sorry, let me backtrack for 1 second before I get to the example. The theory is that the shortages in healthcare are largely driven by lack of supply, not rationing of supply. So there aren't enough doctors is the problem. If you had more doctors in open competition, it would drive price down. Now, the best example of this is in laser eye surgery. So laser eye surgery in the United States is almost entirely deregulated. It's not covered by insurance for most people. It's considered an elective surgery. And that means that doctors actually have to compete on the open market. One of the big problems in our healthcare system is if you walk into the doctor's office and you say, I want an x-ray, how much will it cost me? The doctor literally will not tell you. The doctor literally can't tell you because they have to run it through the insurance company. They have to bargain with the insurance company. They may be covered by this insurance company, but that insurance company. In a socialized medicine system, they just say zero. Well, that leads to an increased demand because there is an elasticity of healthcare demand, and that leads, in essence, to shortages in healthcare supply. Overall, that means that people may live longer because people can access healthcare whenever they want, supposedly. But it also means that when it comes to elective surgeries or when it comes to surgeries that can be delayed, those are delayed very often, and that's something you see from the National Health Service. When it comes to completely privatized systems, if there were complete transparency in price, then you would see an actual supply-demand curve. This is what you see in laser eye surgery, which used to cost $20,000 an eye, $10,000 an eye, now costs like $2,000 an eye because every single doctor went into ophthalmology or optometry, all of them. Right? There are 4 different fields in medicine. My wife's a doctor, as everyone knows. I've said 1,000 times. So that means that virtually everyone in her class went into what they call the ROAD system, right? Radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology, dermatology, mainly because those are the least regulated areas of the healthcare system, where you have to deal less with insurance. So I think that there's almost two separate questions with regard to healthcare. How well are the systems in Britain and Canada working? And by the way, if I were going to pick a socialized healthcare system that I think works best, I'd pick Switzerland, actually, where there's an actual mandate. But I think that because it actually is more privatized and there is some competition in the marketplace. But if you're just talking about what could you do to make the American healthcare system better, we're basically at the worst available points. If privatization is here and nationalization is here, we are here. Right? We're just at the low point of the curve. So I think if you move in either direction, it will get better, probably, in certain ways worse. I'm also very much afraid of a government that comes in and is going to have to mandate how doctors care for patients. Because one of the problems that nationalized systems have had is people opting out of that, doctors opting out of caring for patients in this way. They've had to import doctors, for example, in places like Britain. There's a shortage of doctors in places like Israel. Because who wants to go through 1,000 years of medical school to make 60 grand a year?
Thank you very much.
Hi, Shapiro.
Howdy.
I understand that you don't believe in the rape epidemic, and you're trying to prove a point, and I totally understand that, but I believe your facts are misleading. When I heard you say, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that there are 6 out of 1,000
I said the Bureau of Justice Statistics report from 1995 to 2002 reported that the rape rate on college campuses was 6 out of 1,000 women.
Okay, and from those statistics, which I've seen them before, they're from reported actual crimes, right?
Yes.
Is that what it is?
Yes.
Now,
so it's possible, you're right, it's possible the statistics are higher because of unreported crimes, sure.
Okay, well, you answered my question.
But I will also add that I do not think that for every 6 crimes that were reported, there were 244 that were not. Right? So the idea that the statistics that are being cited, 1 out of 5 women is raped versus 6 out of 1,000, the idea that gap can be crossed simply by people who are not reporting rape, I think that that's a large stretch. I'd have to see some statistical evidence to that effect.
You basically answered my question. The reason I wanted to bring that up is I hope no one listened and believed just everything you said, because your number, 6 out of 1,000, it's like shocking. To some people, they hear 1 out of 5, and then all of a sudden it's 6 out of 1,000. That's a big gap.
Well, it is a big gap, and as I say, even if the gap is not 6 out of 1,000, it is not 250 out of 1,000. Right? People are saying 200, 250 out of 1,000. So you're right. It's in terms of women who are not reporting, but I have no way of actually categorizing that, and you don't have a statistic either. So you're going to have to give me a stat now. Right? I'm using a stat that actually exists. You're saying that stat comes up short. I'm acknowledging that there are limitations to that stat. But in order for you to get to there's a rape epidemic, I'm going to need to know what the actual stat is and how you got there.
I don't got them, so thank you.
Oh, hello, Ben. Big fan. I just had one real quick question. Assuming he runs for re-election, who do you think Trump's biggest adversary is for the 2020 election?
I think Biden would probably be the biggest adversary in terms of somebody who could beat him. Simply because Biden has a lot of blue-collar credibility. For some reason, people seem to like Joe Biden. I've never been able to understand this. But I mean, that's what the polls show anyway. I think age would not be really an obstacle for Biden, considering that the combined age of Donald Trump and Joe Biden takes us back to the Pleistocene era. So I think that Biden would probably be their best bet. I think they're going to make a very stupid mistake and nominate the most progressive person they can find. They'll nominate somebody like Kamala Harris or Cory Booker, because Cory Booker shouts and cries and largely makes a fool of himself in the Senate. But if they were smart, they would nominate Biden. What they would do if they were smart is they would nominate Biden, have him run with somebody like a Kamala Harris or a Cory Booker, and then say, I'm going to serve 1 term because I'm 70,000 years old. And then just hand it off second term to somebody else, and then Biden's achieved his life ambition, and he hands it off to the next in line. That's what I would do if I were the Democrats, but I don't want to give them advice. So please, guys, please run Kamala Harris or Cory Booker.
How's it going, Ben?
Pretty well.
Like a true liberal.
Everybody's alive. We're having a good event. No one's been killed. It's great.
So, I don't know. I've assumed your answer to this question, so I assume you're going to oppose me. However, what should be done, if anything, about the lack of proportionality of responsiveness to the middle and lower class by Congress, whereas the working class makes up a large majority of the country but makes up less than 2% of Congress? Misrepresentation leads to the lack of responsiveness towards the majority group, regardless of where polarized politics stand. And I believe that your answer would have been well, just vote or run. But I think there are issues that surround this in terms of favoring lobbyists and issues such as.
So I'm not of the opinion that the class from which you spring determines the quality of your actual candidacy. First of all, the idea that everybody in Congress is rich is not true. There are plenty of people who are in Congress who don't earn a ton of money, and they vary across the spectrum, right? Bernie Sanders is not rich. Dave Bratt is not rich. They are completely polar opposites on politics. Dave Bratt was making like $100 grand a year as a professor in Virginia, and Bernie Sanders was making whatever you make as a legislator from a commune for the last 3 decades. So the idea that everybody has to be judged based on their level of income, I find problematic. I also think that the founders were not particularly fond of this idea. I mean, all the founders were quite wealthy, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that you actually have the time to dedicate to the job that you are doing, was the idea, at least in the founding era, and that you could be sort of the statesman and not worry too much about your business. Again, I think that I would judge people much more by their viewpoint than I would by their respective wealth. And the idea that people who are middle class and lower class in America are getting screwed is just not true. The fact is that the people in the lowest classes of America are making, just in terms of public benefits, make a significant amount of money more than people at the upper tier. People in the upper tier are keeping a lot of their own money, but they're also paying, as I said in the speech, 96% of all redistributive programs in the United States, plus the entire budget of the federal government, because we don't receive anything back, right? I'm now in the upper income earners of the United States. I'm paying a crap load in taxes. I'm getting nothing back from the government. And, I suppose I should say that's fine, but I don't think that's fine. I don't think they should take my money. I don't think they should take my money in the same way I don't think they should have took my money when I was making a lot less money. So I guess your initial assumption was correct, that I don't really care that much, right? I don't actually care the economic class from which you spring. I care the ideas that you promulgate.
Hi. So very much not a fan, but decided to come anyways.
Okay, it's like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting.
Yeah. So I actually have 2 questions.
Right.
The first one is, how do you account for statistical manipulation when you present your facts that you presented in the beginning? So more specifically, when you're talking about percentages of blacks in X, Y, and Z, and when you're talking about the differences in wages today versus 20 to 50 years ago, how do you account for A, the difference in population among blacks versus whites or other races, and B, how do you account for the increasing gap between the middle class and the upper class?
Okay, so, sorry, 2 things. There are 2 questions there. On any given statistic, I would bet we'd have a more productive conversation if I could actually give you the source. You could look up the source, and then you could ask specific questions about how those numbers were arrived at, because I'm giving you the bottom line, but I'm happy to give you the footnotes. I typically don't do that because it makes the speech even longer and more boring than it already is. But I'm more than happy to argue the stats and whether they're good or not, because it might be like that other guy questioning the Bureau of Justice Statistics stats. Right? There might be a flaw in the stat, and then we can argue about that. So that's a good question. The answer is we'll look at each individual stat, and we'll determine whether we think that it's reflective of reality or not based on its internal logic. As far as the idea that how do I account for the gap between the upper class and the non-upper class, as I said, number one, it's not the same people in the upper class, right? People move up and down between classes fairly regularly in the United States. There is a widening gap in terms of the people who are earning the most and the people who are earning the least, but that's because if you had to make a chart, it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't look like the people at the top are going like that and people at the bottom are going like that. It would look like this, right? People at the bottom are moving up slightly, and the people at the top are moving up rapidly. That's because investment income has done really well under the stock market, for example. So if you had money to put in the stock market, that's been doing really well for you over the past several years, which suggests that one of the ways that you get out of poverty is to save and then get into the stock market. Right? The point here is that when people focus on income inequality, I think that this is actually a rather large moral mistake. I think that focusing on poverty is a good thing to do. I think focusing on income inequality is not a good thing to do because there's no correlation between income inequality and relative rates of poverty. Right? There's tremendous income inequality in a lot of places on planet Earth. In fact, in all places on planet Earth. If you go to Sudan, there's going to be a rich warlord there, and then there are going to be a bunch of people living on $6 a year. Okay, that's a terrible place to live. Income inequality in the United States is also quite high, right? There are people who are Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and then there's the local checker at your grocery store. But if the local checker at your grocery store is getting richer, then it seems to me they have nothing particularly to complain about in how the economy is operating. They don't have a right to Jeff Bezos' money. They don't have a right to Bill Gates' money any more than Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos has a right to their money. So the question shouldn't be relative rates of increase. The question should be, is your income increasing? Is your life getting better? Can you buy more cool stuff? And one of the problems I have with just measuring income by the pure dollar amount is that it doesn't actually measure what you can buy with those dollars. Right? The fact is that you can buy things today that you couldn't buy even 5 years ago, certainly not 10 or 20 years ago. Life is completely transformed. A poor person in the United States today is living better than a rich person was living in the United States in 1920. Right? Everybody has air conditioning, everybody has a microwave, everybody has a car, everybody has a TV or two. Right? All of these things did not exist. That's because the market has created new products for which there is demand. That does not mean that poverty has been completely solved, because I think it's going to be almost impossible to completely solve poverty. But it does mean that if you're complaining because people at the upper end are getting richer rather than because you're getting poorer, then you should look to whether you are operating on the basis of jealousy or whether you're operating on the basis of something that actually should matter.
The second point was just like, as a woman and somebody going into the healthcare field, I personally don't, it's on your opinion on abortion. I personally don't think that like I could have an abortion, just because morally I feel like for myself it wouldn't be the right choice. But how do you defend your opinion as a white, well-off, religious man? How do you defend your, telling a woman what she can do with her body?
Because evil things are still evil, even if I'm a white, well-off religious man. And good things are still good, even if I'm a white, well-off religious man. So this is one of these identity politics points that I really I don't mean to come down harshly on you, I don't, but it is a point that I really have serious moral qualms with. I think it's quite terrible. The reason being that the people who were fighting against enslavement of black people were a bunch of well-off white men for the most part. Right? And those people were saying this is a moral sin. This is a moral blot. They weren't living in the South. They didn't own plantations. They didn't live the lives of the plantation owners. They said this is evil and we are here to stop it. Right? When you see something that you think is morally wrong happening, especially when you're talking about the taking of a human life, like, listen, I think that you shouldn't go around randomly killing homeless people. I just have this view. I'm not a homeless person. Most of the people who randomly kill homeless people are probably not of my economic strata, my religious view, or my I don't know whether they're of my skin color or not. I have no idea what the actual sociological breakdown of homeless killer serial murderers is. But I would suggest that my identity has nothing to do with what is right or wrong. And this is what Western civilization used to be about. Western civilization used to be about the idea that, yes, I'm not a woman in the healthcare field, but you and I can have a conversation about what's right and wrong, because this is the nature of human reason. The nature of human reason, the nature of right and wrong, is that you and I can talk about what's right and wrong, and that I don't retreat into my identity. If we can all retreat into our identity, and our morality is now centered around that identity, morality doesn't exist at all. We break down into a society of fragmented atoms where I can't even say, like, you're torturing a puppy in your backyard. I have nothing to say about that. I'm not a white woman who's in the healthcare field. I'm not going to do that. I refuse to surrender the idea that I can have a moral stance on issues that are of concern to society and of concern to the well-being of the United States simply because of the color of my skin or the nature of my genitalia. And honestly, I believe any view that feels differently is sexist, racist, and bigoted.